prior to anybody thinking about formal training, the militias themselves had no training whatsoever. The rest of us never saw a gun, in many cases. Under the British, if you were rumored to have been at a place where a gun was shown or a gun was there, that was a high crime. If you were convicted of owning one, that was death penalty. So this is a kind of militia that defended its own turf, its own towns. People simply joined together. It was traumatic, to put it simply, and this is an understatement actually. Considering that, I'm talking about myself and I suspect it applies to a lot of others too, I think there was a high degree of innocence and naivete on my part.
ستي هذا انت لما كنت بالبلاد كنت ترزقتي للفريندز مش هيك لمدرسة الفريندز؟
هذا كان بيت
I used to knit this and sell it in Ramallah.
اشتغل وهو وابيعه تيجي وحده مرة تاخذ.
Women used to come and buy this.
بنات بالفريندز معلمات يعني اوادم ناس اوادم.
Later, I met some teachers from the Quaker Friend School who bought my crochet and helped me sell it to others. They were very kind to me.
يشتروا مني وتساعدني حرام كثير مناح كانوا. ولا الاولاد هذول ايش رباهم؟
Who do you think raised the children?
طلعنا ولا إشي ما معنا. على الأرض طلعنا.
We left with nothing.
كانوا في القصة المحصورين مدة أقل شيء 20 يوم 15 بدون.
They were under siege in the Qastal for at least 15 to 20 days, without food or clothes. When we received this news, we sent them aid.
Palestinian defeat? There was no such thing as a Palestinian defeat. It was a total disaster of the whole Arab world. How did we meet that defeat? With a lot of bitterness. We never gave up that somehow we will never go back. So there was a lot of misinformation, a lot of broken promises. And the Palestinians never got together in order to do something about it. We were scattered and spread every which way. We were scattered in Egypt, we were scattered in Jordan, we were scattered in Lebanon, in Syria, some in Iraq, some in Kuwait, some in remaining in Palestine. There was no cohesive force to get us together until the 60s when the Palestinian movement came about.
So there was a sense of having failed in the sense of being responsible for that failure and not knowing exactly what was the reason for that failure or where you have failed. And I did go through a period of depression. You know, we hear a lot about the Vietnam syndrome and this syndrome and the other syndrome. So I think there was a syndrome there too. Fortunately, it didn't last too long. We had to pull ourselves out of it. There was no conscious endeavor on the part of the totality to pull out or anybody talking about it, about the need to address the syndrome, quote unquote. No, I think each one of us handled himself by himself separately.
For a while we were emotionally devastated, and then we were hopeful, and then devastated, and hopeful, and devastated, like everybody else, you know. You get anesthetized after a while, that when there is something hopeful, you don't really attach yourself to it because you don't want the disappointment of losing it. This has happened over and over and over and over again.
Asking whether people resisted or not made me realize that resistance could take a different form and different shape. What resistance meant for me was so different when I resisted the Intifada than what those people experienced in 1948.
I wonder if it makes a difference in the way people tell the story, if they're living in Palestine or in the Middle East as opposed to living in exile here in the United States. I wonder what that becoming exiled has, if it's affected how people tell the story or don't tell it.
I probably can answer that, Adibay, because I was working in the summertime. I went to Palestine. I went back home, and I was working an oral history project on also 1948, and we interviewed a lot of 48 survivors. And since I continued working on oral history projects here in Chicago, interviewing Palestinian survivors of 48, there was interesting points when I think about it between how people told their stories, the people in Palestine, 48 survivor in Palestine, and the people here in Chicago. And I've noticed a lot of interesting things, like people here felt very hesitant, or most of them felt very hesitant telling their story, but on the other hand, people back home in Palestine, they were like, we would walk on, in a refugee camp, let's say the Haisha camp, around the Bethlehem area, people would just grab us from the streets if they know that we're doing a project on 48. They would grab us from the street, they want to tell us their story. When you think about the West, people here, earlier I mentioned that some people are reluctant on telling their story, and they kept saying we're not political. I mean, part of this is because just how the West documented this history. I mean, the story tend to be inaccurate, exaggerated, or untrue. So people thought of their history as not an ideal history. It's all about defeat, and that was part of why they were having a hard time or reluctant telling their personal stories.
I think a big difference is the context people live in here. I mean, this is a country that has really denied that ever happened to the Palestinians. This is a country that glorifies 1948, as we looked at, as something wonderful. So how, as a Palestinian, how do you live in this country when your story is not known, is even denied? So I think that really affects how people talk about it. The other thing is that when Palestinians do get active in this country, they're harassed by the FBI and things like that. So that would probably explain why somebody said, I'm not political, as if telling his own life story could put him in prison. But that's in fact happened in a certain way in this country. And also the climate here, as you see, it's growing, of the anti-Arab media we have here. I mean, not only does our government support policies that deny Palestinian rights, but our media is so anti-Arab, and it really hurts the children growing up here, the American-born generation, because, I mean, on the one hand they're Americans, and on the other hand their country of birth degrades their heritage.
It's only until much later that I came to peace with this confusion of identity. There was no home for me that I could call my own, regardless of where I was. I would meet with Palestinians, and the Palestinian friends would say, you're a traitor, you're becoming Lebanese. And I would meet with the Lebanese, and they say, you're still a Palestinian. I was neither here nor there. Because we are product of a Nakba, we have to excel better than everybody else. We have to become the professionals. We have to study hard. We have to work. We have to do this. The stereotype that we live in here, is amazing. The moment you mention Palestinian, they have ideas of either a Bedouin or a peasant or a terrorist. It took me the longest time so that when people ask me, what are you? I said, the hell with them all. I am a Palestinian. Look at me and judge me for what I am, not for what the stereotype of the papers mention. And I don't even tell them whether I'm Muslim or Christian. I'm a Palestinian. I'm an Arab.
Being born and raised in the States, it's very hard for us to even think about the kind of life they had.
Palestinian politics today are led by people who, in effect, have made a deal with the Israelis and the Americans to forget officially and renounce what happened to them in 1948 and beyond. And I take the view that all of Palestinian history since 1948 is a consequence of 1948. And so given the political fact that this history was given up just to have, people remain in power, then it becomes doubly important for the younger generations of Palestinians to say, look, I mean, that's not the full story. We want the full story. And our story effectively begins in the modern period with the Nakba, with the experiences of 1948, and therefore we must get the story right so that there can be no amnesia, there can be no self-mutilation, which is what has happened. And the only way we can restore ourselves as a people is to have our history. And I think the notion of reclamation is central to this process, to reclaim what has been taken away from us, both by our leaders and by the Israelis.
We hope this project will inspire Arab Americans to collect and preserve the stories and the experiences of the Nakba for the subsequent generations, because these stories and experiences will help us document a history and a narrative that hasn't received adequate attention.
Number one, they're very proud to be included in such a film. Number two, this is their way of preserving their knowledge, their memories of the past. They're very honored that somebody's even listening to their stories. Oral history is always something that fascinates people. And when you can hear something like this firsthand, and to hear the experiences of individuals that you've known and that raised you, that grew up with you, people that you're very familiar with, it makes it so much more meaningful. And a lot of times the history books and news accounts don't take into account the human suffering, the human feelings of the people that live through these times. So this makes it very meaningful, and it gives us a lot of insight into the lives of these people and the hardships and the happiness that they experienced.
Under the British, if you were rumored to have been at a place where a gun was shown or where a gun was there, that was a high crime. If you were convicted of owning one, that was death penalty. I'm talking about myself, and I suspect it applies to a lot of others too. I think there was a high degree of innocence and naivete on my part.
ستي هذا انت لما كنت بالبلاد كنت ترزقتي للفريندز مش هيك لمدرسة الفريندز؟
هذا كان بيت
I used to knit this and sell it in Ramallah.
اشتغل وهو وبيعه تيجي وحدة مرة تاخذ.
Women used to come and buy this.
بنات بالفريندز معلمات يعني أوادم ناس أوادم.
Later, I met some.
So this is a kind of militia that defended its own turf, its own towns. People simply joined together. It was traumatic, to put it simply, and this is an understatement actually, considering that prior to anybody thinking about formal training, the militias themselves had no training whatsoever. The rest of us never saw a gun in many cases.